Hello my soggies. Today I have an absolutely absurd number of books to share with you guys. I wanted to do a list of like all of my favorite books, but I wanted to try capture like a range of favorites. So like I've got my favorite non-fiction here, I've got my favorite poetry. I'm pretty happy with the list that I've compiled. I hope that there's gonna be something for everyone here. I've kind of managed to split all of them up into 4 main camps. First of all, we're gonna go into like classic literature, fiction, very standard classic lit kind of stuff. Then I've got some philosophy. I've got 3 recommendations for that. Then we've got some more fiction, but this is more like sweet nostalgic fiction that are not necessarily books for children, but books that elicit a sort of nostalgia and are very wholesome to read. And last, I've got some poetry, my favorite poetry. I think as we go through this list, you will see that I do have a very particular taste when it comes to books, but hopefully I've cast a wide net considering I am going over quite a few different genres. So hopefully if you're watching this, you will find something that maybe will be very fun for you to read and hopefully will be one of your new favorites. And do please let me know if you've read any of these books, or based off of my taste, if you have any recommendations for me. I'm also going to try my best to keep these as spoiler free as possible. I'm going to try only really discuss the plot as far as it's spoken about in the blurb. In order to talk about what I like about these books, I'm going to try more so focus on like the theme and the feelings that it inspires in me and what I got out of the book, and try and be vague about what actually is the content of the book, because I would like this to be as spoiler free as possible. Some of my favorite reading experiences were ones that I went into completely blind, so I want to try preserve as much of that as possible. That might mean that I won't be able to talk about some of these books in as much detail as I'd like, but hopefully I'm going to still be able to kind of like capture the essence of the book and present that to you guys in a way that is informative enough for you to judge whether you'd like it or not. We're going to start with fiction, and this is all like classic literature. I've got 2 that are old classics and 2 that are modern classics. We're going to start with Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. I think this is probably one of my favorite books of all time. This was written in the Soviet Union. This is like a political satire, and because of that it was really heavily censored when it first came out. I don't think it came out until after Bulgakov died. I don't normally like political satires. Honestly, when I read about this book, I didn't think I would like it so much. At the time, I gave it a try because I was really into Russian literature at this point. I'd read a lot of Dostoevsky, I'd read a lot of Turgenev, a lot of Tolstoy. I was like, okay, let's try Bulgakov. And yeah, when I read about it, I didn't think I would like it so much. Like I said, it's a political satire with a lot of elements of magic, which is something that I don't necessarily always like in literature, or maybe I've just like not read the right things. However, this is one of my favorite books ever. This is so fabulous. It's so camp, it's so theatrical. Recently I've been thinking a lot about the fact that I am always kind of in this like perpetual state of like slight existential dread, but it's not that I don't like it. I secretly love it. Like that's why I constantly interact with media that makes me very existential. I think I really like being existential, but sometimes it does get a bit much, and I think in those situations I really like to interact with media that tackles themes of existentialism in a way that's very absurd and very silly and very over the top and artistic. I think that that really captures why I potentially like The Master and Margarita so much. Where a lot of like classic bigger Russian literature books, like when you think of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and stuff, you think of very like complex, hard, psychological, philosophical questions. And it's not like The Master and Margarita doesn't tackle them, because it does, but it tackles them in a way that is so silly and, yeah, like I said, theatrical, that it kind of helps to digest those questions in a way that I think is a bit more realistic and a bit more hopeful, and I think is very beautiful, where you just realize it's not that deep, and even though you can still interact with those questions in a way that is very serious, because like I said, this was written at a time where like a lot of the stuff he was saying in this book was censored. It is all serious stuff. One of the main questions in the book is like this question of like good versus evil. It's done in a way that is so beautiful and whimsical, and yeah, it's just such a magical book. It's very plot driven, I'd say, more so than other like classic Russian literature books. Like if you think of Dostoevsky, so much of Dostoevsky's work is so character driven and it's so psychological. This has elements of that, but not as much, which I didn't think I would like, but I actually really loved in this. And also because the plot is so like crazy. Bulgakov does make quite a few big points throughout the book, and the way that things come together at the end is very calculated and purposeful, and I really like that as well. I like books that are quite clever in the way in which all the individual kind of plot arcs meet at the end. I love when stuff like that happens, and this definitely happens in this book. There are also a lot of references to theology, to Christian theology, so if you're interested in that, I love theology. I found this so interesting. But yeah, this is just, I think, like, it captures all of the things that I love about classic Russian literature. So like the philosophy, the psychology, the like how fucking much is going on constantly. You know, it's quite a big book, but it does so in a way that I think where other philosophy and psychology heavy literature can often leave me with like, it's very interesting and I'm feeling very inspired, but I'm also feeling quite a lot of dread because like what I've read is so intense. This isn't the case, but this, it still is like so much to think about and analyze and digest once you've finished, but in a way that is a lot more hopeful and I think is a lot more true to life because it's so chaotic in a way that isn't just doom and gloom. It's like even when horrible things are happening in the book, there's still so much humour to be found, and I think that is so fantastic. So yeah, I absolutely love The Master and Margarita. Next, I have a book that like, if you've ever seen my bio on any social media, you will fucking know that I love this book. And it's a divisive book. I've seen a lot of people hate it. I, however, love it. And that is J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Because I'm very picky about what I read, I usually have a pretty good idea of what a book is going to be about before I read it. And I think that that is something that isn't necessarily always great because I don't really get surprised by books often. I'd heard so many people talk about The Catcher in the Rye and I had zero clue. Like when I tell you, not one clue at all what it was going to be about, except for my boyfriend had read it when he was young and was rereading it. And he sent me just the first page and he was like, oh my God, this is exactly how you talk. And I read the first page and I was like, shit, this is like internal monologue as hell. So I was like, okay, that was kind of enough to sell me. The copy that I had didn't have a blurb. I mean, this one doesn't either. I didn't read this copy. I first read a different copy that I think I then gave to someone, but it also didn't have a blurb. And I was like, okay, I have no idea what this is going to be about. I just know that like the first page is relatable. I don't believe in fate, but if I did, oh my goodness, it was fate for me to have read The Catcher in the Rye completely blind because I don't think I've ever read anything more relatable. However, I do think that even if you don't find The Catcher in the Rye relatable, there is still so much to gain from the book. I think The Catcher in the Rye is great for quite a few reasons. First of all, like I said, there's the relatability aspect, and that is very much rooted in like the questions that he asks himself throughout the book. Holden Caulfield, the main character, my fucking twin, views children and childhood very, very high up. He definitely puts that on a bit of a pedestal, and I think particularly in the honesty that children have, and views growing up and entering the adult world as having to give up some of that honesty and authenticity in order to kind of like be a regular adult and do a regular job. He feels like he's almost selling himself in a way, and there's a level of pretense that comes with that. And I think he really looks down on adults and he really, really values children, and I think he still very much sees himself as a child and does not want to make that final cross into the adult world, especially because of the things that he thinks he'd have to give up in order to get there. I really like the way that that message is packaged because I think often with more philosophical work, it can be written in a way that is quite, I don't know how to really phrase this correctly, but it's written in a way that feels quite adult. I think this really does feel like a teenage boy wrote it. I sometimes feel jarred by the way that like deeper, more intellectual philosophical questions feel very inaccessible, and they feel like they're very much packaged in ways that are harder to read, and like you need some prior understanding of philosophy in order to kind of access these thoughts. And I love that this is written and all of these philosophical dilemmas are packaged in a way that like I think most teenagers would be able to relate to. From a more like nerdy perspective as well, there's so much symbolism and there's so much repetition of like themes and symbols throughout the book, which I think is then really, really fun to analyze afterwards. Every time I reread the book, I do notice new things, which is really, really cool. I used to run a book club at my old university, and it was so fun because we had a Catcher in the Rye session, and like listening to the bits that everyone else had picked up on. There's a lot of repeating questions throughout the books, like I said, repeating symbols. And I think if you're kind of nerdy about literature and you really like to analyze things afterwards, if you like to go on Reddit after you finish a book, this is the book. So much of my love for it does just come from the fact that it is so freakishly relatable, but I have people in my life who didn't necessarily find it relatable but still really loved the book. I almost feel sometimes a bit hesitant to recommend this to people because it truly feels like I am opening up my soul to people, which like, I don't know, it's kind of a bit corny to say maybe because of how much hate this book gets, and everyone is like, this is the most fucking annoying character ever, he's the most like unbearable character, he needs to just grow up and get over it. It's like, oh shit, they're talking to me. But anyways. Next I have J.D. Salinger's Franny and Zooey, and I always try to recommend this with The Catcher in the Rye because this I think goes into very similar themes, but I feel like this almost provides an answer to the questions left in The Catcher in the Rye, and I think I read them in that order of The Catcher in the Rye, and then I was like, oh my god, I need more Salinger, and I read Franny and Zooey, and I was like, okay, I feel a lot more at peace, because where The Catcher in the Rye definitely made me feel very seen, and that was very nice. It didn't answer a lot of these issues that I had, but this I think does. I think where The Catcher in the Rye is a lot more general in the kind of like, oh fuck, I'm growing up, like that's really scary. Franny and Zooey hones in specifically on that kind of authenticity aspect of it, this kind of fear of not being authentic. Part of Franny's freak out is about like, no matter what, she's always conforming. If she chooses to not conform, she's conforming in a different way and to something else. It's a bit hard to talk about this one because I think what makes it so brilliant is the end. I think what's really fantastic about a lot of Salinger's work, and can make it a bit difficult to read, is the fact that you don't really know what he's building up to until he gets there, and that can make reading a bit hard sometimes. There's a big part in the middle where like I gave up reading for quite a long time, and I then like bought a copy of this for my best friend, and she was like, yeah, I stopped reading there too, because there's just this really, really long part where it feels like he's not building up to anything and it's just really, really slow. But then like once you get to the end, you're like, oh shit, like, okay, now I see what like all that build up was for, which I really like, but it can, like I said, make the first read through a bit like, wait, what is even happening? And I think that makes it very hard to then talk about, because truly like it's the answer that I think makes this so magical for me. But the answer is like the big spoiler, the big kind of crux that like everything's leading up to. So just trust. If like any of the kind of existential stuff I'm talking about resonates with you, this book will probably provide some comfort or maybe freak you out worse. But either way, that's kind of fun. And my last kind of like classic fiction recommendation is Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Another very, very destroyed book. I love Dostoevsky, which I think is not an unpopular opinion, like fuck, okay, like literally no controversy today. I really like Crime and Punishment as well. However, The Idiot takes the cake for me. And I think that's where, like I was saying earlier in regards to The Master and Margarita, that I really do like a lot of the general themes that you find across like the kind of like classic Russian literature that you read about, like, you know, Tolstoy, Turgenev, all that stuff. I do like the intensity of the philosophy and psychology, but I think The Idiot has a very childish naivety throughout it as well, which just really like makes this my favorite. And like I think with all of these books there's definitely like a theme of childish naivety, like a general kind of theme is emerging. Where Crime and Punishment is a lot darker and rooted in this kind of like, the book feels quite lonely, this is a lot more sweet. The Idiot is one of the loveliest characters I've ever read in my life. Crime and Punishment and stuff, it's like, it's very dark, and also a lot of the characters are very dark, and there isn't anyone who is like just pure of heart. And I think having a character that is just so sweet and loving and embodies so much of these kind of like these traits that I really value and these traits that I really strive towards, and having a character so just brilliant in that way and so childlike, so childlike in that way, placing him in this environment where all these people are absolutely fucking corrupt and crazy and like so psychologically damaged is so interesting to see. And the way in which he responds to these situations that you would normally find in Russian literature with such trust and love and sweetness, I think is so cool to watch. I think also just the general theme, which you do find in a lot of Dostoevsky's work, and again with all the other fucking books I've mentioned already, this really like really valuing the goodness of children, the honesty and love of children. This book I think goes into that philosophy the most intensely from all the other Dostoevsky books I've read. To be told by Mishkin that you are childlike is like the biggest compliment. And also there's a really huge twist, which again, this is another one of those things that like just trust, I don't want to spoil. However, twist in this is fucking crazy, like actually one of the best twists I've ever read, except for the fact that it was spoiled for me. So I didn't get like the full experience, so I don't want to spoil it for you guys, because I think that my reading experience would have been like 10 times more had it not been spoiled for me. However, even with the very big spoiler, it was still so brilliant to read. So yeah, I really love The Idiot. I think it captures so much of what I love in literature, and I'm really excited to reread it. There's a lot of big ass books that I do not ever plan to reread, because as fantastic as they were, it's like I would like to in theory reread them, but I know I'm never going to actually do it. This is one that like, though it is big, I'm like, I will reread this, like unless I like die soon. Moving on now to philosophy / non-fiction books. First of all, I have Epictetus. I love Epictetus so much. This is Epictetus's Of Human Freedom, and this is a collection of his work published by Penguin. This from like the Great Ideas collection. I want to particularly recommend this collection because even though I do have some other Epictetus's work, one of those like big books there is like a big collection of Epictetus's works. This one was the first one I read, so maybe I'm a bit biased and that's why I love it so much, but I also think that this one is like his work that the most kind of like hits me every time, you know, like in the bigger collections it's like it's all fantastic, but every now and then I'll read something and I'm like, whoa, that's like changed everything. This is like only the stuff that changes everything. Epictetus was a Stoic philosopher, so this is Stoicism. However, I think for me personally, out of all the Stoics that I've read, I think Epictetus is my favorite. I don't really know too much about the other Stoics' lives, but it might be partly because of the fact that Epictetus is so just like, he's so stern, to be honest, and I think sometimes you really need that, especially with the kind of philosophy that Stoicism is, where it's very much, you know, like acceptance, giving up control, or at least giving up the illusion of control where you don't have control. You need to be a bit stern with that. You know, if you read someone a bit nicer, like for example Marcus Aurelius, I'm pretty sure Meditations was just his own personal diary, so you know, it doesn't really feel like he's telling you off and he's teaching you, and it's still very cool to read. But this, like, there's parts where it almost feels like Epictetus is laughing at me a bit, like how stupid of me to think that I was in control, you know? And I think that's really, really great, and it's a lot more effective. And I also think maybe partly because he did actually have a very hard life, and a lot of the things that he speaks about are things that he's not just saying, you know? It's clear he is speaking from experience, especially with modern, I was gonna say understandings, but I suppose I mean misunderstandings of what Stoicism is. Like, for example, in like alpha male bro spaces where they talk about Stoicism as like switching off all your feelings, and it's like that's not what Stoicism is. It can often feel a bit like you're being lectured at by someone who doesn't understand. I think with philosophies that are a bit more like, you know, it's not that deep, like you're okay. It can feel a little bit patronizing coming from the wrong person, which doesn't really mean anything about the correctness of that. However, I think first of all, the way in which Epictetus lays out his arguments, regardless of who it's coming from, the way he lays his arguments out, I'm like, yeah, even if I'm a bit butthurt to hear it, I do agree. I have to agree, you know? But also, it is coming from someone who was a slave and was also disabled. So when he talks about things like, for example, there's one part in this that really struck me where he talks about, you know, why do you worry that like your children will die and your wife will die and that your body's going to become disabled? Like, your body's not yours, your wife and your family aren't yours, you're entitled to nothing. When I found out that he was actually disabled, it's like, okay, like he is talking from experience, and it doesn't really feel like he's just like telling you to get over it without knowing what it feels like. This is someone who actually has suffered. This philosophy clearly must have helped him. Although when I first read this and I found this to be so effective and fantastic and interesting, I didn't know anything about his life. So it's like an interesting add-on to know that a lot of things he talks about are his direct experience. I think for me this was particularly effective because so much of my anxiety back when I was anxious was linked to this feeling of needing to be in control, and my anxiety would be triggered. I thought it would be triggered when I didn't feel like I was in control or when I was losing control, but I also think I would make myself anxious by constantly trying to be in control. Even that kind of like when I thought I was being really hypervigilant, that in itself was quite an anxious feeling. And I think why this was so effective for me was because so much of this is like, if something horrible were to happen, okay, you weren't entitled to have it any other way. Yeah, that really helps to hear. For so long, I rejected this sort of philosophy because I was like, no, if I give up control, that's going to make me even more anxious because my anxiety is rooted in the fact that I'm not in control. But actually, giving up control entirely, though it sounds counterintuitive, was the most effective thing. And I think reading this for the first time really opened my eyes to like, I could just stop giving a shit about all this stuff, you know? And I could just accept the fact that the worst thing might happen and I'm just going to have to be okay. Or as Epictetus says, the door is always open, which is quite dark, but I found that to be very soothing, to be honest. So yeah, I love Epictetus. Next I have Simone de Beauvoir's What is Existentialism? I really love existentialism. However, I think particularly with like the classic French existentialist fiction, like when you think of like Camus and like Sartre and stuff, I don't really like a lot of those books. I couldn't finish Nausea because I didn't like it. The Outsider is probably the book I've read the most in my life, and that is because I fucking hate it. I really, really don't like The Outsider, but I hear everyone rave on about it so much that I kind of convinced myself that I must be the problem and I must be rereading it. So I have reread it like probably once a year since I was like 15, 16, and like every year I don't get it. I really don't get the hype that much. Or like, I guess I could see what the hype is, but it just doesn't do it for me. But I really do like existentialism. And I think that is why when people ask for existentialist recommendations, I don't really recommend the fiction because I don't really like the fiction. I recommend What is Existentialism? This is also Penguin Great Ideas. However, it's like an introduction which is very, very short and like not necessarily that important to the bulk of the book. And then it goes into Simone de Beauvoir's essay, Pyrrhus and Cineas. So if you can't find this copy, just find Pyrrhus and Cineas. That is like, it's the same thing. I think this is such a fantastic introduction to existentialism. First of all, because like I said, I don't like the fiction existentialism, but I do really like existentialist thought. But also, Simone de Beauvoir explains at the beginning that existentialism is very, very hard to explain. It is not something that she'll be able to just explain in one interview or one book. Even this is like an introduction. It's not even like, what is existentialism? But perhaps maybe the reason why it's written about in fiction so much is because it is easier to talk about indirectly and easier to use metaphors for. And I do respect that. However, I really like the way in which Simone de Beauvoir went about that, which is that she opens with Pyrrhus and Cineas, which is like a story. It's very, very short. That's like the whole thing. And then she uses that as a jumping pad and like uses that analogy to then dissect and discuss. There's also just so much going on, which I personally really like, because when I first read this, I didn't really know much about existentialism. And so a lot of the stuff was lost on me, but because there's so much going on, it's like, I'd be reading one part and I'd be like, she's fully lost me. I have no idea what she's talking about. But then a new part would start and I'd be like, okay, I can try again with this one. And I think that was really, really great. Off the top of my head, I think the parts that stood out to me when I read this were questions about why we should do anything if everything ends anyways. Very classic existentialist question. In what ways we relate to others and in what what ways we relate to our actions and in what way we can claim ownership and responsibility to our actions and to the actions of others around us. Yeah, just very classic existentialist shit, but in a way that I think is really, really fantastic. And yeah, I think in terms of like stuff I've read to do with existentialism, this is probably my favorite. There's just so much going on that every time I reread it, I get new things from it, and I just don't really like existentialist fiction. So, although as a very quick side note, I do really like Jean-Paul Sartre's plays. I don't know whether this is like strictly philosophy, to be honest. This is more like feminism. I have The Right to Sex by Amir Srinivasan. This book is so fantastic, and if anyone wants to get into feminism, I really recommend this as a brilliant starting point. I actually skipped school to go see her talk about this live quite a few years ago. I think maybe when it first came out, because this only came out in like 2021, I think. And that's partly why I think this is something that I recommend so much, because there's a lot of very interesting feminist thought that is important to read to have an understanding of feminism and kind of like how we got to this point. But okay, what do we do now that we're at this point? This is great because it talks about feminist issues that are very modern, like very, very modern. It talks about pornography, but specifically pornography now. It talks about our education system now. It talks about the importance of intersectional feminism, but also the way in which intersectionality can be applied poorly to feminism and the issues with that. It's just a lot of questions that I think are very, very relevant. I wish that people who didn't believe in feminism could read this. I think it's such a shame because, you know, I wish everyone just fucking automatically like agreed that, you know, women shouldn't be oppressed. But I used to talk quite a lot on TikTok about my personal experience and my personal thoughts about like feminism and stuff. But if someone were to watch that and doesn't really believe in like misogyny still being an issue, which like is fucking crazy, then like why would they give a shit about my individual testimony? You know, there's like, they just don't believe in it. And I think what's really great about this book for people who might be like misogyny deniers is that half of this book is just sources, and I think it is written in a way that is so accessible. I think this is a fantastic introduction. If you don't know anything about feminism, this is so fantastic. But I think even if you do know quite a bit, because when I read this was like the first proper book about feminism I'd read, but before then I had interacted with a lot of feminist media, more so like films and fiction, and also like a lot of conversations with friends, but I didn't go into this completely blind, and still I learned so much from this. This is absolutely brilliant. I really, really recommend this. One of my favorite things I've ever read. Next, I have some more fiction to share with you guys, but this is more like sweet fiction that I find to be very nostalgic and less intense in the kind of like psychology breakdown existentialist way, but it's very, very sweet and lovely and wholesome. First of all, I have The Little Prince, and I cannot pronounce the author's name. All French Songüres 3 viewers can like please skip a few seconds. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I fucking love The Little Prince. Not to bring up The Catcher in the Rye again, but how I found The Little Prince was after reading The Catcher in the Rye, I was like, holy shit, like, okay, well, I've just seen myself on like paper. I need to find more books like The Catcher in the Rye. And I was doing some digging on like Reddit, I think, and I found people talking about the Jungian archetype of the puer aeternus, the eternal child. And I've written down some things from Wikipedia about the puer aeternus. The puer aeternus symbolizes newness, potential for growth, and hope for the future, but also symbolizes the child man who refuses to grow up and meet the challenges of life head on, waiting instead for a ship to come in and solve all his problems. Very relatable. And then I was watching some videos about the puer aeternus, and I kept seeing The Little Prince being brought up. And I knew a lot about The Little Prince because it's obviously like, it's a childhood classic. Most people I knew had like read it or heard of it. I just heard so much about it, but I'd never actually read it. And I thought it was just like a children's book, and it is a children's book, but I didn't really know if I'd gain anything from it. So I'd never really had a reason to read it. But after seeing it brought up so much in these videos that I found crazy relatable, I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. And I went to Waterstones with my boyfriend, and I sometimes do a cheeky thing where if there's a book I'm not sure about reading, and if it's quite short, I'll go to Waterstones Cafe, I'll take the book, I'll read it, and I'll just like put it back. And I'm obviously very careful to not damage it at all. And I did that with The Little Prince, and I was sat with my boyfriend, and poor him, he was trying to revise, and he was sat across from me, and like every minute I would nudge him and be like, oh my God, listen to this. And I was like crying like the whole time, like no joke. I don't mean like teary, like I was crying the whole time reading this book because it was so sweet and lovely. I think all of the things that I said about The Catcher in the Rye apply to this, but whereas The Catcher in the Rye tackles all of these dilemmas from a teenager's perspective, this is more so from a child's perspective / from an adult looking back on a child's perspective. It's just so lovely. I think the fact that it's a children's book is so lovely as well. I don't really know what a child would get from it because I didn't read it as a child. I read it as an adult, and the things I got from it are very much the things I got out of The Catcher in the Rye. But I think my mum read it as a kid as well, and she said that she really, really loved it, but she found it quite sad. But then I've heard other people say that when they read it as kids, they found it to be really, really beautiful and inspiring. And I think what's also so cool about it is like, because I'm talking about it from the perspective of like, I fucking love The Catcher in the Rye and oh my god, this is literally like Catcher in the Rye for kids. But when I've spoken to other people about it, they don't really get that. And because the whole thing is like an analogy, like the whole book is an analogy basically, different people very much get different things from the book. And most people I've spoken to about the book, and I've spoken to some people who like also say that this is their favorite book ever, when they describe it, it's like, holy shit, I didn't even see that. And it's really cool that this book seems to almost like morph to whatever the reader needs. It's just very beautiful. It's so lovely. I definitely recommend this to everyone because of how applicable the book seems to be to everyone that I've spoken to. Next, I have another book by Simone de Beauvoir. I have The Inseparables. This book, I think, was like found recently or something like that. When was this published? English translation 2021. I remember like, I think Penguin posting about this on Instagram, like new book by Simone de Beauvoir. And I was like, wait, hasn't she been like dead for ages? And I think it's because they found this like semi-recently. Oh, it literally says on the front, the newly discovered novel. I recommend this book to everyone who likes sweet books about children. However, particularly to all my girls who have at any point in their life had very close female friendships. This book is like the most fantastic and accurate portrayal of female friendships I've ever read. A little bit of like a personal insight into the Soggy Rice 3 mind. Although I've had a few partners and I'm currently in a relationship and I absolutely like, I love my partner so much. I think I'm much more struck by friendships than relationships. And that's not to say that I don't love the relationships that I'm in. I absolutely am like infatuated with my partner. But I don't think I get shy in relationships. I think I'm a lot more confident in relationships. And I also think if I had to choose between, okay, if I can only have a romantic partner or friendships for the rest of my life, I would absolutely choose friendships. For me, having a romantic partner is like a really cool bonus, but I think for me the most important thing in life is friendships. And a lot of literature is focused about romance in a way that is very much like romance is put on a pedestal and it's like, oh my god, the most important thing is having a relationship. And the way that romance is handled in literature, I think often is with like so much giddiness and it almost seems holy. And I never really found that super relatable because I do feel that towards a partner, but I think the most intense I've ever felt, this kind of like giddiness and this kind of like, oh my god, this relationship feels holy, is in friendships, specifically female friendships. And this book really talks about female friendships in that way, which I found to be really fantastic to read. And it's really nice to hear some love for the female friendships. I've never really felt shyness in relationships, and I think that is because I'm queer, but I've only ever been in long-term relationships with men. And something I've found is that like, I just don't think I care so much about the opinion of men as I do women. And that's not to say that I like don't care about the opinion of my partners, but I've never been in a relationship with someone who I've not been very good friends with before. So what tends to happen is I meet this guy, I don't really care what he thinks of me because like, what the fuck, loads of men just hate me from the get-go because I'm a woman. And then I like get to know them and I really like them, but by that point I have already been very authentic and myself and not shy, and I'm confident in the fact that they like me. So then we get into a relationship and then I'm not really shy in that relationship. However, with women, I'm very shy. I don't know why, but I think I really value the opinion of women. I think I'm just really quite like struck by women. What that's kind of manifested as is that in a lot of my female friendships, I'm so giddy almost. And I think I also have like a slight avoidant streak. So I'm often a bit hesitant to share how in love I am with people. That makes it hard in friendships versus relationships, because I think in relationships it doesn't feel as vulnerable because there's this kind of expectation that you will share how in love you are. So when I do it in a relationship, it's like, but of course I'd share how in love I am. I'm in a relationship, right? But with friends, you don't have to. So it feels a lot more vulnerable because when I'm telling my friend how much I love them and when I'm really kind of like putting my heart out on a platter for them, I don't have to do that, so it's automatically a bit more vulnerable. Whereas when I do that to a romantic partner, it's like, but of course I would. And I think Simone de Beauvoir really captures that like so well. And a lot of things that I'd like never really even clocked as anything in particular. They were just things I'd experienced that I'd never really named. And then I read this book and this kind of like shyness and giddiness and like this feeling of almost being like in love a bit with your best friend. I was like, wait, shit, like I didn't realize that was even like a thing to name. And I think that Simone de Beauvoir captured it really beautifully. And probably part of it is because this book is based on her and her best friend growing up, and I think it really comes across that like the things she is talking about is something she's very much experienced, very clearly is like semi-autobiographical. I think if you are someone who's a bit giddy about female friendships, this is really beautiful. I really love this. This is one of the most relatable things I've ever read as well. Also, I just suddenly remember this is a quick fun fact about Simone de Beauvoir. I just finished my A-levels and I was at a bottomless brunch with some friends and my ex-boyfriend. We were very drunk because it was a bottomless brunch at Turtle Bay in like the middle of the day, and my ex-boyfriend was like, I need to go do something, like something very important has come up, I need to go do something. We were all drunk, so we didn't really like he just kind of disappeared and we were like, okay, I guess. And then he suddenly appears again, and bless him, he had bought me Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex as a kind of gift because I'd finished my A-levels and I'd been talking a lot about how I really wanted to read it. I think that's there. I still have not read it because it is a very big book. However, that was very lovely of him, and he sits down and he was like, oh yeah, I bought The Second Sex. I just went to Waterstones to buy it. But it was really weird when I was asking for it. The booksellers were acting really weird. And I was like, what do you mean the booksellers were acting really weird? And he was like, oh, like, I just asked them, like, oh, can I have The Second Sex by Mr. Simon de Beauvoir? Who the fuck is Mr. Simon de Beauvoir? And apparently he had asked, like, oh, can I have the feminism book by Mr. Simon de Beauvoir? So bless him, shout out Mr. Simon de Beauvoir. Last but not least, I have some poetry to share with you guys. I, for many years, was an adamant poetry hater. And I think that is because of the way that poetry is taught. I don't know about other curriculums, but in like British schools, we have the poetry anthology that we have to study for GCSEs. So that's like an exam that we do when we're 16. The poetry anthology is just really shit. I think there's not a lot of variation in the style of poetry. I think the way it is taught, it's a lot more about, which makes sense because you're learning it like in a school, I guess. You're not really taught to engage with the poetry from an artistic point of view at all. You're really taught to engage with it in a very methodological way, which I think is important, but I wish that we also got to play with the poetry a bit more, and I wish we were encouraged to appreciate the poetry a bit more. Still to this day, I don't like a lot of the poetry that we were taught in the poetry anthology, and like stylistically I just don't like that type of poetry that much. There were a few that I liked, but a lot I didn't. I do have a style of poetry that I prefer, and I wonder if maybe we had been taught that style of poetry, maybe I would have appreciated poetry more at a younger age, because yeah, I was adamantly a poetry hater. And then I read some Rumi. This is some of the most brilliant poetry I've read in my life. It's very, very mystical. It is very much grounded in Sufi thought. There are some slightly smuttier poems, which I think is quite interesting. There are some very romantic poems, but I think the poems that speak to me the most are the ones that are grounded in Sufi thought and are very mystical and very spiritual. Let me find one to read to you guys, just so you guys kind of like get the gist. There are some that I feel like I learn from, but there are also some that I feel like are very beautiful expressions of this kind of restlessness that I feel sometimes. So for example, A Thirsty Fish by Rumi. I don't get tired of you. Don't grow weary of being compassionate toward me. All this thirst equipment must surely be tired of me, the water jar, the water carrier. I have a thirsty fish in me that can never find enough of what it's thirsty for. Show me the way to the ocean, break these half measures, these small containers, all this fantasy and grief. Let my house be drowned in the wave that rose last night out of the courtyard, hidden in the centre of my chest. Joseph fell like the moon into my well. The harvest I expected was washed away, but no matter. A fire has risen above my tombstone hat. I don't want learning or dignity or respectability. I want this music and this dawn and the warmth of your cheek against mine. The grief armies assemble, but I'm not going with them. This is how it always is when I finish a poem. A great silence overcomes me, and I wonder why I ever thought to use language. Holy fuck, I love Rumi. And then yeah, like I said, there's some that I think are a bit more like that's how I'm trying to be, rather than how I am. Quietness. Inside this new love, die. Your way begins on the other side. Become the sky. Take an axe to the prison wall. Escape. Walk out like someone suddenly born into colour. Do it now. You're covered with thick cloud. Slide out the side, die, and be quiet. Quietness is the surest sign that you've died. Your old life was a frantic running from silence. The speechless full moon comes out now. Okay, let me read one more. Sorry guys, but I actually fucking love Rumi so much. This one used to really strike me when I was like quite anxious. Now that I'm not so anxious, I don't really find this to do the same thing to me anymore, but for my Anxious Soggy Roast 3 viewers, hopefully this will help you. A community of the spirit. There is a community of the spirit. Join it and feel the delight of walking in the noisy street and being the noise. Drink all your passion and be a disgrace. Close both eyes to see with the other eye. Open your hands if you want to be held. Sit down in this circle. Quit acting like a wolf and feel the shepherd's love filling you. At night your beloved wanders. Don't accept consolations. Close your mouth against food. Taste the lover's mouth in yours. You moan, she left me, he left me. 20 more will come. Be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside of the tangle of fear thinking. Live in silence. Flow down and down in always widening rings of being. So hopefully that will be helpful for someone. I love Rumi and I really recommend Rumi. Last of all, I have Yeats. Yeats I've not read that much of. He was an Irish poet, I think. I very much put him in a similar camp to Rumi in regards to kind of like how the poetry strikes me. From what I've heard, I think Yeats was also very influenced by mysticism and spirituality, and that really comes across in his poetry. Because I've not read nearly as much Yeats as I've had Rumi, rather than trying to explain his poetry, I'm just going to read the two poems that kind of like sold me on Yeats when I was younger, and if they tickle your fancy, maybe Yeats is for you. So the first poem I have by Yeats, I cannot find, which is really annoying. It's a picture I took of my friend's book like 2 years ago, and that was like the first time I'd like properly read Yeats, and I was like, wait, this is so beautiful. This was my favorite poem at the time that I read in my friend's book, and I quickly took a photo of it, and I like don't have the name of the poem or anything, so if you know, please let me know. But soon a teardrop started up, for aimless joy had made me stop beside the little lake to watch a white gull take a bit of bread thrown up into the air, now gyring down and panning there. He splashed where an absurd, portly green pated bird shook off the water from his back, being no more demoniac, a stupid happy creature could rouse my whole nature. And I remember when I read that, I was like, oh fuck, me now that I'm better. And I remember that really, really struck me. And then I bought my own collection of Yeats poems, and I don't really feel too confident in explaining Yeats, especially because, like I said, I know a lot about the Rumi lore. I've read a lot about Rumi. I've not read so much about Yeats. Another one that really struck me by Yeats, this is from Words for Music, Perhaps, which was written in June 1932. And this is number 8, Girl's Song. I went out alone to sing a song or two, my fancy on a man, and you know who. Another came in sight, and on a stick relied, to hold himself upright, I sat and cried. And that was all my song when everything is told. So I an old man young or a young man old? I wish I could say more about Yeats. I really, really do. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to include him because I have so little to say about him, but I think it is just that I have not read enough by him to be confident. I think poetry I'm maybe a little bit less confident talking about because I've been reading poetry for a lot shorter. I've got like slight imposter syndrome when it comes to like giving poetry recommendations. So yeah, I really, really recommend him. I think as someone who loves Rumi, I do get a very similar thing out of Yeats. So if you like Rumi and if you like that kind of poetry, I really recommend looking into Yeats as well. Anyways, that was my very, very big pile of favorite books. I really, really hope that something in there might have struck you and might be interesting for you. Please let me know if you've read any of these and if you like them. If you don't like them, let me know if you've got any beef with my list, please, because I love hearing other people's opinions on books. And also based off of my taste, is there anything that you'd recommend for me? As always, please like, subscribe, comment. I love reading your guys' comments. And thank you so much for watching all of this. I'm going to go now on a big walk with my best friend, I think. So I'm very, very excited. Anyways, bye-bye.